The bang at the door pulled Chris from his nap. He rolled in bed for a moment, wondering what was happening. The noise intensified, and he limped out of bed. His dog Annie wagged her tail as she followed him to the front door. Outside were cops. He recognized one of them as Sheriff Nolan and the other as his deputy, Daryl. They had their eyes on him ever since he returned to town. "Put your hands where we can see them, Chris," Sheriff Nolan barked. "What's going on?" Chris asked, confused. "Do as he says," Daryl said, pointing his gun at him. Chris lifted his hands, and as he did, the deputy pushed him against the wall. He struggled, and a gun was placed against his back. The sheriff went into the building with another officer right behind him. Chris noticed the crowd that was slowly beginning to form. His neighbors across the street were watching the debacle with their phones out. His head lowered in embarrassment. He had done nothing wrong. He didn't even know what was happening to warrant the cops coming over to his house and treating him this way. He heard noise from within the house as the cops ransacked his home. Annie barked and they yelled at her to shut up. Poor Annie. She was a dog he rescued, whose former owner had been violent. She had to be very scared. The officers returned. The sheriff held up a bagged pistol that made the crowd gasp. "You're under arrest, Chris Jacobs, for the robbery and assault of Scott Brown," the sheriff said, just as the cold cuffs clamped around his wrists. Chris struggled, voicing his innocence as he was taken to the police cruiser. Cameras flashed in his face, and he was shoved into the back seat of the car. His head lowered, and he burst into tears. He had done nothing wrong, but why would they believe him? The town of Burke had a pretty decent-sized police station. It used to be smaller, but as the population grew, so did the crime rate and expansion. However, budget cuts affected the maintenance of the building, and Chris sat in a freezing dark interrogation room. He had been left here for more than 3 hours, going by the wristwatch. He had called out several times, but no one answered him. This was not fair, but nothing had been suitable since he got out of prison. The world treated him like a vermin because of a mistake he made 10 years ago. He had returned home to Burke, another mistake he had made, and the people made it obvious they didn't want him around. They crossed to the other side of the road when they saw him. They walked past him with their noses lifted and hands clutching their bags. They grabbed their children like he ate kids for breakfast whenever little kids strayed to him with curiosity. The first week he had moved back, there had been some sort of petition to get him kicked out of Burke, but the council votes had failed, and he was considered free to remain in Burke as long as he was of good behavior. Yet he had been treated as a threat for 3 months since he returned. The people he once considered friends treated him like they didn't know him, cutting ties with him. The door opened with a creak. The sheriff had with him a half-eaten donut which he munched hungrily. "I need a lawyer," Chris said, the first thing that came to mind. A lawyer hadn't saved him 10 years ago from going to prison, but still, he needed one. "You are scum," the sheriff spat with hate. "Piece of shit. You're going back to prison, and you ain't coming back from it." He was enjoying this. The sheriff had always hated Chris, and with good reason. "You should never have come back here," the sheriff said. There was a sound at the door. The deputy joined in, who gulped down a bottle of soda. "You confess yet, boss?" Daryl asked. "I did not." "Shut up!" The sheriff hit the table, making Chris jump. "You robbed old Mr. Brown, who has always been kind to everyone in town." The sheriff was right. Mr. Brown was one of the few who didn't treat Chris like he was the Antichrist. The man even gave him a job mowing his lawn and invited him for dinner. Chris shook his head in denial, afraid of what the sheriff would do if he said a word. "You went to his house with the pistol, hit him on the head, and stole all his savings. I always knew you were an asshole, but to go this low, you are a monster, a disgrace." Tears pooled in Chris's eyes at the words. How many times had he heard those words from people? From his mother when she had come to him for the first time and the last time when he was in prison. From his then-fiancée who had told him she could not wait for him and needed to move on with her life. "I didn't do anything," Chris said. He would never hurt Mr. Brown. Never. He had never deliberately hurt anyone. "Then explain what the pistol was doing in your house," Daryl asked. The sheriff shot him a look, and he kept quiet. "It belonged to my father," Chris simply explained. He had done some spring cleaning a couple months ago and found it. He should have listened to his intuition and gotten rid of it, but he had kept it for sentimental reasons. "You're drunk of a father." Like father, like son, the sheriff laughed. His dead father had been one of Burke's most minor favorite citizens. He had been a drunk and couldn't hold on to a job for more than a month. As a young boy, Chris had promised himself that he would not end up like his father. Unfortunately, he had beaten his father's record of not going to prison. Chris yelped in pain as the sheriff grabbed him by the neck. He was a burly man who used to be a boxer. His eyes boggled as the sheriff's hold on him intensified. Your life is over as you know it. You are not coming back from this. Boss, I think he's dying. Daryl's voice drifted to him. The sheriff let go of Chris, who gasped frantically for air. He had felt at that moment that he was dying, and he had been ready to give up. The life he was living was no life. It was one filled with regrets and torment, one he was tired of. I would like to speak to my client. They turned around at a voice. For the first time, Chris was relieved. His cousin, Ashley, was a lawyer and lived in Burke. Your cousin is not getting away with this like last time, the sheriff sneered. You have no evidence against him, do you? Ashley asked. He was seen leaving Mr. Brown's house last night, the sheriff said. I had dinner with him, Chris defended. After which you knocked him over and stole from him, the sheriff said. Mr. Brown is in the operating room. When he comes out, he will tell us the truth. Until then, you can't keep him, Ashley said. The sheriff glared at both of them with hatred. He had hated them since that fateful night that a drunk Chris had been the one driving in an accident that had taken the life of his only brother. An accident that had made Chris go away to prison for manslaughter, but got out on good behavior a couple months ago. They rode back home quietly. Chris was heavy with thoughts and worry for Mr. Brown. He hoped he was going to recover from the attack. He was a kind man who didn't deserve to be attacked and stolen from. Did you do it? His cousin asked when they arrived at the house. His head lowered in disappointment. Of all people, she would know him better. Most of his family had given up on him. He would be out on the streets if he had inherited the house from his mother. No, I did not, Chris said. She didn't believe him. He could tell the way she looked at him. Don't leave town and stay at home. All eyes are on you right now, Ashley said. Annie ran to him when he opened the door. He hugged her. She was his only friend and probably the only one who believed in him. The house was a mess. It seemed like a storm had passed through. They must have returned and continued looking for something to implicate him. He moved past the chaos and set up a place to rest his head. He closed his eyes but was unable to sleep. Sleep was far away from him. He had a feeling his situation was going to get worse. He was right. The following morning, Chris was rearrested on charges of murder. Mr. Brown had died overnight, and a neighbor had given a statement that she saw him leave after a scream came from the house. He had been kept in the interrogation room for more than half a day without food or drink. He had asked for his lawyer, but the sheriff ignored him, taking his fingerprints and making snide remarks about him. The sheriff came in. He was pretty happy to see him go down. He had never forgiven him for being the driver in that car 10 years ago. Driving drunk was the worst mistake of Chris's life. He had been young and stupid, ending with him losing his best friend and spending years in prison. He had paid his dues, but to everyone else, he was still the monster who had cut short the life of Burke's sweetheart and the mayor's son. Karma's a bitch. It's over for you, Chris. I am so glad I am alive to see you fall. They are going to give you the electric chair. I will make sure of it, the sheriff sneered. Please, Nolan, believe me, I didn't do... Chris groaned in pain as he saw stars, with the sheriff's fists running into him. He doubled over as another punch hit him in the stomach. Soon he was on his knees as blows rammed into him, filled with anger and hate for him. Your life is over. Fucking over, the sheriff said. Sheriff, you're going to kill him, Daryl said, pulling him off Chris. He deserves to die. He's nothing but trouble. The sheriff spat as Chris reeled in pain. He didn't do it, Sheriff, Daryl said. He fucking did it. We got a confession. Tom and Blake's picked up a guy hitching out of town. He got blood over him and some of Mr. Brown's jewelry. He was high on drugs and confessed to killing him. He's got a history, Sheriff. He's the one, not Chris, Daryl said excitedly. The sheriff pulled away from Chris, staring at him in surprise and then disappointment. I told you I didn't do it, Chris whispered as a cloak of relief descended upon him. With all fingers pointed at him and a criminal record, it would have been easy for him to be sentenced for a crime he didn't commit. As he headed out of the building a couple of minutes later, wincing from the bruises, he decided he would no longer be a coward and allow people to treat him with disdain and disrespect. He had gotten a new opportunity in life, and he was going to grab it by the reins and make the most of life.
Alice and Jack met at a nightclub. Alice went there with friends to celebrate her 18th birthday. It was her first outing into the night social life, so to speak. Before that, her parents did not allow her to visit such places, so it was a whole event for her. It was at the club that she met Jack, who was 10 years older than her. He was already an accomplished guy. He had a great job as a history teacher at the university. In addition, he was also engaged in tutoring. He had no complaints from his students, so he earned very well. Jack immediately liked a young girl who was very beautiful. He came to the club for his friend's birthday. Since he was driving, he did not drink alcohol, but he watched others with interest. He invited Alice to a slow dance, then another, and another. And at the end of the evening, the girl fell in love with her older admirer. She gave him her phone number and then waited patiently for his call for several days. They started dating, and 2 months later, Jack proposed to her. Alice's parents were against such a quick wedding. They hoped that she would graduate from university, but Alice stood her ground. They gave their blessing, taking into account that the girl promised not to drop out of school. Alice was happy. After the wedding, she moved in with her husband, who had a wonderful apartment in the downtown area of the city. She did not drop out of university and kept her promise because she graduated. She and her husband had a great relationship. Alice was just a young girl when she married him, and with him she blossomed and matured. 5 years passed, and Alice began to notice that sometimes her husband began to behave strangely. Sometimes he would come home a little tired and thoughtful, and sometimes, especially when he was late, he was in a great mood. He joked, hugged his wife, told her about his love for her. Sometimes he did not come home empty-handed. He would bring her a bouquet of flowers, then some kind of surprise, like buying a cake. His cheerful mood pleased Alice at first, but then she began to suspect something. "Well, I don't know. Let's follow him or something," said her friend Kate when Alice told her about her suspicions. "Come on, what are you saying? I don't suspect him. I'm just like that. I feel a little uneasy, Katie. I don't know why, but I'm worried. It's like something bad is waiting for me around the corner, and I won't know anything until I stumble upon it," Alice said thoughtfully. Kate took her by the hand and looked straight into her eyes. Said, "Alice, you know that you have very good intuition." "That's what scares me," Alice replied. Kate squeezed her hand. "Then do your best to find out the truth, no matter how bitter or sweet it is. You don't have to sit flat on your butt, honey, and then you'll regret that you missed your happiness. Better act," and Alice decided to act. With the help of her devoted friend Katie, she found a private detective who was ready to follow her husband. For a tidy sum, a man watched Jack for 2 weeks, and in the next meeting, he laid out the results of his observations in front of Alice. And she was shocked before the truth was revealed. Jack had a mistress, a very beautiful girl with a charming voice and a gorgeous figure. Jack saw her 3 or 4 times a week. They would go to a restaurant located in the VIP zone, and several times they came to the hotel, rented a room. They were there for several hours. The most shocking thing for Alice was that the girl was very young, just like she was when she met Jack. The mistress was only 18 years old and had just graduated from high school. Alice silently digested all the information. She was ready to cry, but right up to the moment when the detective told her, "The information, as I understand it, is very important to you, and I have done something else for which you will have to pay extra. In addition to these pictures on the street, I also took a series of pictures of a different nature. Of course, additional expenses were required here to ensure the confidentiality of access to the hotel room. You will have to reimburse me for monetary damages, but I thought it would be important for you. It seems I was not mistaken." Of course he was not mistaken. Alice was willing to pay any money for such evidence. Seeing Alice's enthusiasm, the detective asked for twice the amount he was going to announce, and Alice did not even raise an eyebrow. She didn't have that kind of money with her, but she transferred that amount. She knew that her husband would have questions about where she spent such an impressive amount, but she would come up with something. She would say that she had paid a fee for an expensive fur coat. This would convince Jack. As soon as the money was transferred to the detective, he handed her a hefty envelope and a flash drive with a satisfied face. All of the information, both photos and videos, is on a flash drive. But, for convenience, I also printed everything in paper form. I hope you were satisfied with my work. If you ever need my help, then I am ready to do anything for you. You see, everything, not just a detective investigation. Hints that the detective could perform not only legitimate operations caused Alice a feeling of disgust, but she was even more disgusted by the pictures of Jack's meetings with his mistress, whose name was Emerald. Even her name was beautiful, and the photos showed the smallest details. Yes, she should have shown more gratitude to the detective. He spared no expense on the equipment. The faces were clear, and the photos were from different angles. Half of the pictures were taken near, half from far away. Alice felt sick. That bastard! He seemed such a wonderful husband, but in fact, the most ordinary womanizer. And the girl! Still milk on the lips is not dry and already tumbling with other people's husbands. That snake! Kate was indignant when a friend showed her the pictures. Alice didn't say anything. She herself was in love with Jack at the age of 18. It's no wonder that this girl also got caught in his web. She cried over these photos the whole day before. Jack asked her in the evening why her eyes were so red, and Alice simply replied that she had a headache. But now the girl had no tears. She realized that Jack had trampled on her love, and she longed for revenge, but only such revenge as to destroy Jack. She needed to come up with something that would ruin his life, and then she would leave him. Thank God she had a diploma in her hands, so she will be able to get a job and support herself. It's good that her parents forced her to study. Now, look at that. And he also does tutoring. Yes, he should be kept away from decent society, Kate persisted, swearing more and more. And then Alice had an idea. Jack is tutoring, teaches at the university, and he values his reputation very much. He is quite calm about any mistakes of other people, but he carefully monitors himself. It's strange that he walks with his mistress in front of everyone, although maybe he tells everyone that this is his niece, she thought. Alice realized that a ruined reputation would be the best punishment for her husband, and she began to implement her idea. To do this, she called a detective. If he's not just doing surveillance, then he could help her. He was just the right kind of person. Unprincipled, cunning, resourceful, and she needs him. She called him. He recognized her immediately. Or maybe he wrote down the number of a generous client. Most likely it was because when he picked up the phone, his voice was very sweet and friendly. I need your help. No, there is no need to follow anymore. No, the photos are no longer needed. I need a different kind of help. I'll tell you. And Alice told him what she needed to be done. At the end, she announced the amount she was willing to pay for this service. When she finished speaking, she heard the detective's insinuating voice. A very generous reward. For that kind of money, I'll do anything you say. I am completely at your disposal. I need something else from you. If you get me the list of his students, it will speed up my work a lot. A cold smile appeared on Alice's face. I will do it. You will receive the lists tomorrow. 3 days passed. Jack was humming a tune when he was driving to university. Today, he had another date with Emerald, and he figured out how to have fun today. He wanted to quickly share his idea with his young girlfriend. He had been anticipating the most pleasant evening. When he entered the auditorium, he was struck by the deep silence, surprised by the unusual behavior of the students. He began the lecture. But after 10 minutes, he realized that something unusual was happening. He began to look at the students, but most of the students were sitting with their eyes downcast. Some looked at Jack with some kind of contempt or disgust, and only a few people looked directly into his eyes. Jack got angry. "What's the matter? Is there something written on my forehead, dear? I don't understand the reason for this behavior." Everyone was silent. Then Jack turned to one of the students who was staring at him intently. "Andrew, what's the matter with you all today? What happened?" After a few seconds, the guy looked from Jack to the blackboard behind the teacher. "We're all right, Mr. Jack. Look at the board." It seemed to Jack that an eternity had passed when he finally managed to figure out who was in the photos posted on the board. When he realized that he and Emerald were in the pictures, he shuddered. How is this possible? Who did this? Why did they do it? And where did these pictures come from? He turned to the students and asked in an ominous whisper, "Who did this? Admit who did it. Otherwise, I will not allow the whole group to take the exam." Andrew replied, "Mr. Jack, honestly, it's not us. We went into the auditorium and then these pictures were already hanging. It's not us." Jack turned back to the photographs. His face was flushed with embarrassment and fear. Emerald's parents are not aware of their relationship. No one should have known about their relationship. And if Alice finds out, it's going to be a nightmare. He didn't want to lose his wife. Jack quickly went to the board and began to tear off the pictures. A minute later, the board was empty. Jack breathed a sigh of relief, but as it turned out, he was overjoyed early. Just as he wanted to address the students to ask them not to spread about this incident, the door to the auditorium opened. "Professor Jack, you are being summoned to the dean's office." An hour later, Jack was on his way home. An unpleasant conversation with the dean, who received an envelope of pictures of Jack and Alina, disrupted lectures, a request to write on his own, too many events in 1 hour. Jack wanted to get home faster. He has already figured out what he will say to his wife. After all, this information could also reach her. As soon as he entered the apartment, he called Alice. "Darling, are you home? What happened is terrible. I'm going to tell you this now. Imagine, I was fired. This is all Hammerson's machinations, I'm sure. He's always scheming against me, so he took these photos to defile my reputation." And then Jack saw 3 suitcases standing in the hallway. He looked at them in bewilderment and then went into the kitchen. Alice was sitting at the table drinking coffee. She was calm and did not even change her face when she saw her husband. Jack looked at his wife in confusion. "And what are these suitcases, dear? Are you leaving somewhere?" Alice put her cup on the table, folded her hands in front of her, and replied, "Yes, I'm leaving." "Far away? For how long? And why didn't I know about it?" Jack continued to ask. "For a long time, for a very long time." Jack turned pale. Then he asked, "What happened? I understand nothing." Alice smiled, but there was no warmth in her smile. "Don't you understand? Strange. I knew that the situation at the university wouldn't teach you anything, so I hedged my bets. Maybe too hard, but you deserve it, right? You are such a wonderful, loyal, loving man, and you managed to be like this not only with your wife, but also with your mistress. So, since you are so loving and generous, then let everyone who respected you know about it." Jack paled even more as he said, "What did you do?" Alice spoke calmly. "I hired a detective. He was following you, and he took all these pictures. I did this so that the pictures turned out to be at the university and at the dean, but that's not all. All your students now have these photos, and I also sent them to your mistress's parents. And I have no doubt that they will not leave you alone. Her dad will be very angry, and I'm sure of it. I congratulate you, my husband. You're a star now. And yes, one more thing. I filed for divorce." Jack dropped to his knees in front of Alice. He was still thinking only about losing his wife. "I'm sorry. I don't know what came over me. I love you so much. This girl is to blame for everything." Alice furrowed her brows. "What are you talking about? Are you out of your mind? I hate talking to you. I'm leaving." Alice got up and went out into the corridor. She dragged the suitcases into the entrance and then slammed the door with all her might. and Jack remained sitting on the floor. He was staring at one point, and his phone was not subsiding from calls and messages. The bell rang again, and Jack took out his phone and looked at the screen. Emerald was calling. He picked up the phone. "Jack, my parents know all about you. This has turned into such a scandal for me. I had to admit that you are married and cannot marry me, and my father is very angry. I told him your address. I'm sorry. He's coming to you." Jack didn't say anything. He disconnected the phone and threw it against the wall with all his might. The mobile phone went silent forever, and Jack grabbed his head and ruffled his hair. He lost everything: his beloved wife, job, authority, reputation. What else was waiting for him ahead? He was afraid to imagine. "Mom is no longer with us." Catherine heard her father's quiet, confused voice. He stood perplexed, with the phone in his hand, looking at Catherine with a devastated look. Daddy, what's wrong? Please tell me." Catherine was shaking her father's hand, and the wild fear of tragedy shackled the whole body of the 15-year-old girl. "Your mother died during childbirth," the father replied, stammering and barely holding back tears. Unbearable pain squeezed the girl's heart. Just yesterday, they were discussing the name of the future baby with Mom and Dad. Catherine had pressed her hands and cheek against her mother's stomach and listened to her sister move. And at night, her mother was taken by ambulance to the maternity hospital with contractions. Catherine hardly slept the rest of the night, waiting for the joyful news and imagining what her little sister would be like. Catherine didn't want to believe what she had heard. Shock, fear, indignation, and misunderstanding overwhelmed the girl. No, no, no! She felt as if everything inside her screamed. Acceptance began to come to her gradually. Grief gripped the family. Catherine and Dad hugged each other tightly and cried bitterly. A few days later, the baby was discharged from the hospital. "Our Mirabelle," Catherine and her father spoke at the same time. Mirabelle was the name they all chose together on the eve of her mother's unexpected. Dad and Catherine brought little Mirabelle home and put her in a crib. The baby girl yawned and smiled sleepily, as if to show that everything will be fine. "I am your Mirabelle." Catherine quickly matured because now she was taking the place of Mirabelle's mother. Catherine took full care of her sister. Little Mirabelle was happiness and joy for their family, and 5 years later, another tragedy came to their house. Dad was gone. Everything reminded Catherine of her former happiness, about her carefree childhood while her mother was alive, about how she and Dad raised Mirabelle together. But Catherine also could not forget all these tragic events that took place in her home and in her family. "Mirabelle, you're going to school soon," Catherine said. "What city would you like to study in?" "In a big, beautiful one, so that there was a river and a zoo, a skating rink, and even carousels," Mirabelle listed, bending her small fingers to count. Catherine hugged the girl and realized which city they would move to the place where happiness awaits them. The evening in the Smith family passed as usual. The head of the family, George, while waiting for dinner, aimlessly clicked the buttons on the TV remote and scolded without malice that there were more and more channels, and there was simply nothing to watch with pleasure. Elizabeth, along with her 12-year-old daughter Emma, cooked simple but very tasty dishes. "Remember, daughter, when you mash the potatoes a little, then add milk, be sure to warm it up at the beginning." "I know, Mom. You've already told me that 1,000 times." "We also need to make sure that the foam does not get there." The girl charmingly wrinkled her nose, showing her attitude to this product. "Do not worry. It is simply impossible to forget your science." George and Elizabeth's eldest son, Danny, 25, was also in the kitchen, having returned to his father's house after a short marriage of 3 months. He was slicing vegetables for a salad and thought how lucky he was with his family after all. How could he have imagined that his wife Lily, who claimed her faithful love, was so easy and simple to cheat on him? Parting with his wife greatly affected the guy's ego. His ex-wife reproached him for financial insolvency and lack of activity in the performance of marital duty. In general, the only joy in this difficult situation for Danny was the fact that his relatives did not get on his nerves, and they just didn't think about Lily, as if she didn't exist. Finally, Elizabeth, together with the children, cooked all the dishes, and the whole family traditionally sat down at the table. Between mashed potatoes and salad, the son announced to his parents that he would celebrate New Year's Eve, not at home, but with his former classmates. Harry got divorced too, invited Andrew, Serge, and me, in general, our entire male company, both housewarming and celebrating the new year at once. The news did not come as a surprise to parents. After all, they understood perfectly well that their son had grown up a long time ago. And besides, all the guys listed were well known to them. Andrew, Serge, and Harry met Danny at school, and surprisingly, time did not affect their friendship too much. They studied together at the same institute. And Harry and Andrew even worked together, and Elizabeth and George, without collusion, thought that an evening with old friends would help him unwind. "Say hello to all the guys for us," Danny's mom smiled tenderly, and in general invited them to sit with us sometime. "I haven't seen them for a long time. I missed them." "That's right, son. We'll get your console from the mezzanine, and we'll play like before." George got the idea of his wife. Emma tried to ask Danny to come to Harry's New Year's celebration, but received a firm and terse refusal from her brother. "Don't even think about it." The month remaining before the holiday flew by unnoticed. After congratulating his parents and sister on the upcoming, Danny got ready to visit a friend. In one hand, the guy had a bulky bag with groceries that he had bought on the table, and in the other, with Mom's salties. With all the supplies, he went to Harry. Because of the terrible ice, the sidewalk looked more like an ice rink. And Danny saw how, almost at the very entrance to a friend's house, a girl fell backwards, absurdly waving her hands with packages. Approaching her, he put down his bags and helped her get up and collect the rolled tangerines. "Oh, thank you very much," the stranger thanked him. "I don't understand how she managed to fall." The girl only looked straight into Danny's eyes for a few seconds, but he felt a warm and pleasant feeling in his heart. "Absolutely, not at all. It's so slippery here." And the guy hurried to pick up his bags, because his plans did not include a new novel at all. However, it turned out that both he and the stranger go to the same entrance. The girl, after a little hesitation, still entered the elevator with Danny. They almost said in unison, "I'm on the 4th." It was impossible not to smile. And the girl asked, "Are you going to Harry's by any chance?" "Yes, this is an old friend of mine." Dima really liked the gray eyes of the traveling companion and the cute dimples appearing on her cheeks and the minimal amount of cosmetics which his ex-wife was so fond of. "I have agreed to celebrate the New Year with him. Are you going to celebrate with him too?" "No, I live next door to him." A short conversation was interrupted with the opening of the elevator, and Danny decided to introduce himself for some reason. My name is Daniel." "Catherine," the girl answered, and opened the door with her key, letting her companion inside and showing that Harry lived here. "I wish you all the best, and Happy New Year." Danny knocked on the door of Harry's apartment and soon found himself among loyal friends. "Oh, what a surprise, Danny," Harry yelled with joy. "Didn't we lock the door here?" "No, your neighbor let me in, Catherine." "Good girl," the landlord immediately responded and added, "It's a pity that the girl is a little harsh." Andrew and Serge's friendly laughter erupted immediately. "Has she already turned you down? Did you not appreciate the unearthly beauty and cosmic charm?" In a noisy atmosphere of mutual jokes, friends saw off the old year, and the apartment continued to be filled with new guests. Harry explained to his friends that he had also invited his colleagues, who had nowhere to celebrate the holiday. As a result, The company turned out to be twice as large as planned. Instead of friendly gatherings of 4, 10 people gathered. The atmosphere, despite the fact that many were strangers, was cheerful. But there were problems with the furniture. A sofa and 2 chairs were available, but there were not enough seats at the table. And Harry turned to Danny. "Listen, friend, can you go to the neighbor and ask for chairs? And then we have some kind of buffet, turns out." Danny was surprised to realize that he was as worried as before a date when he knocked on Catherine's door. A pretty girl in a simple but surprisingly suitable dress opened the door for him without asking who came. And from behind, with enthusiastic cries, a girl of about 6 jumped out with huge bows fluttering over pigtails like exotic pink butterflies. "Mommy, Catherine!" "Hooray! Santa Claus has come!" "No, Mirabelle, it's not him," Catherine replied. "It's Daniel, a friend of our neighbor." Excuse me, can you help out with the chairs?" Danny was a little surprised that a noticeably young girl as Catherine seemed to him had such an adult daughter. Harry, it seems, called the whole city to him, he said, trying to make an awkward joke. "I imagine," Catherine said. "Of course, I'll help you out. Mirabelle and I are celebrating together today. We're not waiting for anyone, so we'll sit on the couch." In the kitchen, there was an appetizing aroma of vanilla. He didn't even really want to go back to his friend's apartment. However, he took the offered chairs and with regret left the girl he liked so much. The fun was in full swing, but Danny was uneasy. He wanted to look into Catherine's eyes again. And even the girl's daughter didn't bother him at all. Therefore, he gladly volunteered to walk to the nearest open supermarket when it turned out that Andrew had forgotten to buy water and tonic, which the ladies from Harry's work who came to the party erratically asked for. "Come on, Andrew, I'll walk with you, otherwise it will be hard to bring." And there was ice on the street, Danny said, and he remembered how he met Catherine. Even in the store, he couldn't get rid of thoughts of Catherine and Mirabelle waiting for Santa Claus. He added a soft rabbit and a surprise toy, a Santa Claus hat and beard, a bar of high-quality chocolate, and a bottle of sparkling wine to the cart. Catching the surprised look on his friend's face, he explained, "I'll bring it to my neighbor for letting us use her chairs. Otherwise, I'm uncomfortable." Danny put the souvenirs for the charming Catherine and her daughter in separate gift bags, and sliding and cursing, the guys still got to their destination. Andrew brought the drinks into Harry's apartment, and Danny, wearing the attributes of a fairy tale character, knocked on the neighbor's door again. "Where is the girl who was waiting for me?" Slightly changing his voice, he asked Catherine and winked. The joyful Mirabelle looked attentively at the guest and hurriedly told him poems and in general everything that seemed important to her. She told him, "Next year I will go to school. I already got a backpack, and after the holidays, I'll go back to prep school. It's good that you came to us because Catherine doesn't believe in miracles at all for some reason." Handing the girl a well-deserved gift and waiting until she ran away to examine it, he handed a modest present to Catherine. "It's like compensation for chairs, inconveniences, and in general. We will obviously make noise and we will interfere with Mirabelle's rest." "Danny, how embarrassing. I don't even know how to thank you. Mirabelle wanted a holiday so much. As luck would have it, I didn't have much money now, and it's expensive to order Santa Claus during the new year as a fee to pay a world-class star. All you're doing today is helping me out." Tears sparkled in Catherine's eyes, and Danny hurried away. Because another minute, and he would have completely lost his head. The magical midnight in which it is customary to make a wish flashed by. Fireworks were booming, and Danny did not forget for a second about the neighbor who was so close, and, at the same time, so far away. He was trying to figure out why he was attracted to the girl. But then he gave up on everything and began to come to her after work. They took Mirabelle with them, and remembering their childhood, they went downhill, played snowballs, and just enjoyed life. The romance developed quickly, and on March 8th, Danny decided to introduce Catherine to his family. Elizabeth, having learned that her son would bring a girl to whom he wanted to propose soon, began to ask Danny, "Who is she? How old is she? Aren't you in too much of a hurry?" Danny told her everything he knew. He did not keep silent about the fact that Catherine is raising Mirabel alone. Elizabeth tried to reason with her son that having children is not easy. She explained that he would have to build a relationship not only with the woman he loved, but also with the girl. And it's not easy, both morally and financially. Danny cut off all the lectures. I do not care. Please don't be upset, but I'm not leaving Catherine or Mirabel. When they first met Catherine, Danny's parents were wary about her. Elizabeth looked into the girl's face, could not drive away from herself the unpleasant thoughts that her son wanted to burden himself with raising someone else's child. Only the younger sister was childishly enthusiastic. Emma, having filled the plates with delicacies, handed Mirabel lemonade and glasses and immediately took the guest to her room. Danny tried to shield Catherine from Mom and Dad's questions, but when Elizabeth asked the girl to help her with the plates, George restrained him, who rushed into the kitchen by the hand, and he whispered softly, "Don't bother Mom, son." Elizabeth did not stand up for a long time and immediately asked a direct question. "Catherine, I'm sorry, it's none of my business, but are you really only 21 years old, as my son said?" The girl, without ceasing to wipe the plates, nodded yes. "And anticipating your question, I will answer. I was not married, but do not rush to draw conclusions. Mirabel is my sister. Mom died when Mirabel was born. My father died a year ago from a heart attack, and we moved to this city. It was too difficult for me at home, a lot of unhappy memories, and nothing kept me there. I don't tell the Cavaliers right away that Mirabel is actually not my daughter, but my sister, because it is simply impossible to separate us. She calls me Mom, too. Anyway, I've been raising her since she was a baby. I have no one closer to me, and I understand that I do not want to communicate with them at all, and we are clearly not in the way." Elizabeth, sobbing, hugged the girl and said, "I hope Danny passed this test of yours." Catherine smiled sheepishly because he had passed. "I just don't know how to tell him about it." Elizabeth and Catherine returned to the table with puffy eyes, but smiling. That evening she told Danny the truth. They celebrated the next New Year already acting as a young family, and Harry was a witness at the wedding because he was charming and a good neighbor. Jessica dreamed of being independent and successful from an early age. She studied hard, participated in all school and student Olympiads and competitions, and won prizes. In appearance, she was not particularly different, but if you looked closely, you could see a charming beauty in her. Jessica knew what she wanted, and she had big plans for life. Since her main goal was her studies and career, she had neither the time nor the desire for relationships with boys. She met Stephen at university, and she could not even think that this particular guy would change her whole life. He was not bad to look at. Many girls at university ran after him, and he did his best to impress only Jessica. Jessica was certainly flattered by the attention of such a guy, and she could not resist his long and romantic courtship. Afterwards, these meetings turned her head, and she fell head over heels in love with him. Many of my friends keep saying that this is true love, love for life. Stephen immediately noticed this beautiful girl with a charming smile, bright green eyes, framed by thick dark eyelashes and luxurious hair below the shoulders. And after a while, the guy realized that he was in love, and fortunately, the feelings were mutual. They started dating, and after some time passed, they got married. Very soon after the wedding, Jessica realized that she was pregnant. Stephen accepted this news with great joy, although they had not planned for children yet because they did not have anywhere to live on their own. They were each renting their homes, and there was simply nowhere to go. Stephen and Jessica worked hard to achieve their goal. When Jessica went on maternity leave, Stephen remained the main breadwinner. He was extremely hardworking and responsible, which is why he quickly climbed the corporate ladder, and his salary also increased. When their daughter Brittany was born, Jessica devoted herself to motherhood and taking care of the house. And a few years later, when their daughter was already going to kindergarten, they were finally able to buy an apartment. But at the family meeting, they decided that it was too early for Jessica to go to work. Brittany was often ill, and besides, Jessica attended various club meetings. And since all the grandmothers lived far enough away from them, there was no one to take care of the child except Jessica. Fortunately, Stephen's earnings by this point were decent enough, so there was enough for everything. Jessica was an excellent hostess. She cooked perfectly, and their house was as clean as if in a museum. Her husband was waiting for a hot, delicious dinner after work, and in the morning, he had pressed trousers and shirts ready for him. As time went on, Brittany had already started school, but Jessica still didn't work. No, she was not lazy. She just lost and forgot a lot of things in her profession during the time that she did not work in her specialty. Now, it was difficult to get back into the same rut, but Stephen did not insist. On the contrary, he liked his domestic wife. Brittany was 11 years old when Jessica realized that she was expecting a baby again. The ultrasound showed that they will have twins. At the appointed time, the boys were born, and they looked just alike. But the children were born prematurely, so they were also very small. While she was feeding one, the other was crying, and vice versa. The days for Jessica were mixed up with the night. It's good that Brittany is already independent, Jessica thought, rocking her sons continuously. And it was true. Brittany not only kept up with her studies, lessons, and clubs, but she had time to help her mother, unlike Stephen. Coming home, Stephen began to take out his stress more and more on his wife, and Jessica became more and more immersed in everyday life with incessant screams, porridge, and diapers. She always tried to justify her husband's behavior, and she sincerely believed that most men accept children once they can already communicate and play with them. Moreover, her husband was very busy at work, and she knew this from him, as he often said, "This is not an apartment, but a kindergarten of some kind. Can I have a little rest after coming home from work? I've been working all day without leaving my office even for lunch, and that's why I want some peace at home." Well, these are children. How could she explain it to them? Jessica tried to calm her husband at such moments, but he only left, shutting himself in the room so that he would not be disturbed. Jessica laid out the blocks again and again, built pyramids, and played with the kids. She loved her children with all her heart, and it seemed to her that this was her destiny, and no matter how difficult it was for her without outside help, this situation is temporary, because children grow up so fast. But every day, the gap between the spouses became bigger and bigger. Claims, understatement, resentment, all this accumulated day after day, and at one moment poured out. Stephen came home from work earlier than usual, silently went into the room, opened the closet, and began to put his things in a suitcase. "Are you being sent on a business trip?" she asked, not understanding anything about what was happening. "I'm leaving," Stephen said quietly. "What do you mean? Where to?" And then Stephen broke down, perhaps for the first time in their entire life together. "I'm leaving you. Have you not looked in a mirror lately? Look who you've become like. I'm already tired of you with your eternal whining." "Is that all?" Jessica responded in a calm tone, but barely held back tears as she asked, "Are you tired of me?" "But why don't you just tell me about it? I thought you loved me. Your looks bother me. Have you seen yourself in nothing but sweatpants and sneakers, and you have an ever-present ponytail on your head? I'm not talking about makeup at all. All my friends' wives look like they're going to rock. You're like a dirty girl alone." Stephen spoke to his wife without mincing words. "What about the children?" Jessica asked in a somewhat detached voice. "And what about the children? They will grow up and understand. I will help financially. I will leave this apartment to you, although I could take my share." She turned around and left the room. Tears blurred her eyes, but she tried to hide her face, as she had pride and dignity since childhood. Grandma used to say, "No matter how hard it is for you, Don't show it to a person who intentionally wants to offend you. If you're going to cry, then do it into a pillow. Meanwhile, Stephen seems to have taken his things and left the apartment. After crying until morning, she never closed her eyes, and in the morning, having cleaned herself up, she tried to behave as if nothing had happened. She could not hide her mood from Brittany, so she had to tell her what had happened. Her daughter's reaction startled her. Jessica was afraid that her daughter would cry or withdraw into herself, but Brittany calmed her mother as best she could, assuring her that she would help with everything and that they would live no worse than others. From that day on, their lives changed abruptly. All funds began to run out quickly, and there was no help from Stephen. When Jessica tried to contact him by phone, a woman who introduced herself as Stephen's new love picked up the phone and, not in the mildest form, asked them not to bother them anymore. Jessica didn't know what to do. It was necessary to find a job urgently because the twins had already started going to the nursery. But no one was eager to hire a woman with 3 children, especially with 2 of them being so young. One day, after failing another interview, Jessica got upset and drank coffee and looked out the window analyzing her life. A phone call interrupted her thoughts. Her friend, who she studied at the institute with, called and was very friendly. Realizing that something had happened to Jessica, she quickly asked for a visit. When her friend Gloria arrived at the apartment, Jessica told her to have a look around. "It's no wonder Stephen ran away," Gloria said from the doorway. "I'm sorry, but you look like a housebug. Tell me, where did that Jessica that laughed all the time that I once knew go?" "I'm not laughing right now. Do you need help with work? Do you have anything in mind for me?" Jessica asked with a heavy sigh. Gloria thought about it. "There is, but for this you need a transformation." They spent the rest of the day shopping and chose an outfit for Jessica. Then they went to the beauty salon for a new hairstyle, manicure, and makeup. After 2 days, Jessica was in a hurry for an interview for the position of administrator in the most prestigious hotel in the city. The director was Gloria's husband's brother, so Jessica was given the job without hesitation. In addition, she immediately made friends with the team, mainly consisting of girls about her age. Jessica made friends with one of the other girls, who offered to cover Jessica's shifts if she ever needed it. At home, Brittany helped her with the twins. She took the kids from the nursery when Mom was at work. Stephen never got in touch, and he did not seek to see the children, for which angered Jessica. Jessica certainly liked almost everything at work, except for the uniform, which had to be worn by order of her superiors. But it seemed to Jessica that the length of the skirt was indecently short, which she immediately informed the director with a request to issue a longer dress. Having been refused, she decided to be patient and not get into trouble. This job was absolutely necessary for her, but she felt uncomfortable, often adjusting the hem of her skirt. Once an important guest stopped at their hotel, the girls told various tall tales about him, but the fact that everyone disliked him was an indisputable fact. "He is always dissatisfied with everything, finds fault with everything. Everyone dreams that he doesn't come on their shift," the maid Monica chattered. In general, from the conversations of colleagues, Jessica realized that he has a serious business and is friends with the director of the hotel. Therefore, it was necessary to please him, otherwise you could lose your job. And already on Jessica's next shift, an unpleasant incident happened. It all started with the fact that the room attendant of this guest came running all in tears. Then he called the administrator for an explanation, and Jessica, anxious about the situation, hurried to settle it. On the one hand, she really wanted to look at this man since he stopped by, and he wasn't on her shift, and on the other hand, it was scary. "Well, I suppose he won't bite," Jessica thought after knocking on the room. When the room opened, she saw a handsome middle-aged man, but with a very dissatisfied face, which did not bode well. The man was wearing only trousers, which made Jessica feel embarrassed and blush a little, but he quickly went on the offensive. "What kind of administrator are you if you can't keep track of your employees?" he began. "But first, I would like to clarify the essence of your claims," Jessica said, trying to be as polite as possible, giving him her best charming smile. This discouraged the man a little, but only for a second. He continued menacingly. Not only did she bring me a wet towel, but also the breakfast was cold. Do you think I should eat this slop? Having said that, he knocked over the breakfast tray on the floor. Naturally, all its contents were immediately absorbed and smeared on the expensive carpet. The room was considered one of the best. His act caused a storm of indignation on the part of Jessica, who no longer tried to restrain herself. Do you know who you are? You are a real cad. You would do well to learn good manners. You seem to be able to withdraw business, but alas, not to communicate with people. Do you think that since you are a wealthy man and a friend of the owner, that everyone here should be afraid of you and worship you? You're wrong. And let me be fired today, but I will not be silent. Apparently, the truth was said about you that you are a real snob and a fool. Saying this, Jessica stomped out of the room, constantly tugging her skirt. She did not see that he remained standing, looking after her. Jessica immediately went to write a statement, realizing that after the incident, dismissal was inevitable. When she entered the director's office, she found him on the phone. He motioned her to a chair, inviting her to sit down and wait, and then learning about the reason for her visit. He said there had been a misunderstanding, and he had no complaints about her. Early in the morning, the next working day, a surprise awaited Jessica. A huge bouquet of unique and insanely beautiful flowers was on the table, and inside it was a note from which she understood the sender's name. It was the fool with whom she had quarreled the day before. His name was Jacob, and he invited Jessica to dinner that evening. Naturally, Jessica, by virtue of her nature, considered this just a mockery, so she decided to ignore the invitation. But she couldn't help but think about him often. After that, Jessica went to the hospital with the boys. It turned out that they had fallen from their rocking chair together and received severe bruises and concussion. The nurse who came into the room asked Jessica to come out to the waiting room. Jessica was amazed when she saw that Jacob was waiting for her, shifting from one foot to the other. He timidly invited her to talk outside. After making sure that the children were asleep, Jessica went outside. I came to apologize. You didn't come to dinner then, after that incident. I think about you all the time. I have not met such girls for a long time who are not afraid to stand up for themselves, even at the cost of their work. You're proud, and I like it. And also, Jacob hesitated a little, let me take care of you. But I have 3 children who I love dearly. How do you see it? Jessica said in a trembling voice. Wonderful. I adore children. I'm sure we can be friends. A few years later, Jessica and Jacob had a daughter together, and the whole family went on vacation. At the airport, Jessica accidentally ran into her ex-husband Stephen, who could hardly recognize his wife, a stunningly beautiful young woman. Noticing him, none of the children wanted to approach him. Jessica passed by, feeling his gaze on her. Stacy constantly cursed fate for how long she had to die. It all started with mild ailments, which she did not attach importance to, but then noticed that she was getting weaker. Previously, work had brought her pleasure, but now by the end of the day, she felt completely exhausted and went to bed as soon as she came home. Then Stacy took a vacation and went to rest with her husband. But there she only got worse and had to go to the doctor. So, she learned a disappointing diagnosis. Although at first, she was still told that it was possible to recover. It would just be long and difficult. Over time, the doctors became increasingly gloomy. She had few relatives by blood, and she was far away, so she began to communicate with her friends less and less, and even her husband distanced himself. She understood it wasn't easy for him either, but that didn't make her any less bitter. The slow decline was painful for her. She would much rather accept a quick death than prolong her days month after month. She began to walk with a cane, slowly, like an old woman. And then the day came when her legs refused. The very next day, her husband Brian began to persuade her to go to the hospital, although the doctor said there was no difference whether she would be there or at home. Stacy wanted to stay at home, and yet she let herself be persuaded. Maybe at least it would be easier for him. but every day it became increasingly unbearable to stay there. And when the doctor said that she had a week or two left, no more, she still asked to go home. Brian stood in the hospital corridor and watched his sick, dying wife being loaded into an ambulance. He looked after her and did not want to believe that such a burden would fall on his shoulders. He stared and stared until the doctor's voice pulled him out of his heavy thoughts. Brian looked at the elderly, cheerful man in a white coat and did not understand the words. The doctor seemed to move his lips without any sound, and Brian unsuccessfully tried to make out what he was saying. The doctor looked sternly at the patient's husband, as if realizing that he did not understand the words he said. "Can you hear me? Good. Look, we did everything we could. Your wife is dying. So let her spend her last days with the man who loves her. Just be with her. She doesn't ask for more. And who knows? Maybe God will have mercy. It's not for nothing that her name is Stacy," the doctor said. He paused for a moment and continued. "I would advise you not to hire a nurse, because she has a couple of weeks left at most." The doctor left, and only the smell of medicines remained hanging in the air like a disembodied spirit. Brian looked back towards the ambulance. They were waiting for him. Then everything happened as if in a terrible dream. A man watched as a car drove up to his high-rise building, brought his wife into the apartment, and placed her on the bed. 2 hours had passed since his sick, dying wife had been brought to his apartment. Brian could not come to terms with this. "Brian, my dear, come to me," the wife pleaded hoarsely, but he did not come. "Thank you, my dear, for taking me and sheltering me. I so want to die next to you in our apartment, where we were happy." She coughed heavily with some deep, gurgling sound. He covered his ears with his palms and plopped down on the chair with force, and it creaked loudly. He wanted to respond, but he couldn't. Brian spread out the sofa and went to bed, hoping that his wife would not survive the stress of the trip and would die by morning. But his hopes were not destined to come true. Brian woke up an hour before the alarm clock, and he made himself a coffee and went into the bedroom. His wife was sleeping, still breathing. For some reason, this fact angered him so much that he barely restrained himself from screaming. He was shaking all over with anger. Brian stormed into the kitchen and threw the mug against the wall with all his might. The brown liquid flowed in a large stain over the floor tile, on which not a single scratch was found. He exhaled heavily and began to cry. He was sitting on a chair, and tears of impotence and hopelessness were quietly flowing from his eyes. It was so good when she was finally admitted to the hospital. He could start a new life. He was so deeply immersed in his own thoughts that he shook with indignation and anger. He quickly caught himself when the doorbell rang and hurried to the door and opened it. "What took you so long?" A young beauty was standing there impatiently, holding 2 large glasses of to-go coffee in her hands. "Hush! They brought mine back," Brian quickly said in a whisper. He looked around anxiously, although he understood that his wife would not be able to get up on her own. He stared at the young mistress, who shrugged her shoulders and entered the apartment as if nothing had happened. She took root here during the time that Brian's wife was in the hospital. The girl went into the kitchen. Brian was so angry. "What are you doing?" "You said she was very sick, that she was dying, so she wouldn't get up. Come here, I've missed you," the girl, whose name was Jody, said quickly in a loud whisper, snuggling up to the man. She kissed him with such fervor that he could not resist. When they finished, he had to go to his wife's bedroom, sending the girl to the shower to continue there with her. The husband brought his wife a glass of water, gave her pills, and went into the shower, continuing to have fun. That's where they came up with a plan to get rid of his wife. He was looking forward to being alone with this beauty soon and being able to do whatever he wanted again. After all, his wife would leave him all the wealth, and she was far from poor since she had been working all this time. After her death, he and the new woman will not have to work at all. The girl left, leaving Brian alone with his dying wife. He began to collect her things. Brian packed a full bag and dragged it into the car. Having laid out the back seat in the car, he covered it with a thick blanket and then returned to the apartment and immediately went to his wife. She literally lit up with happiness when she saw him. "My dear, how I missed you. How good it is that you are next to me," the woman said, barely smiling, as she didn't have enough strength for anything else. "Stacy, listen. I have a friend who will help you. If we have no hope for medicine, then we will heal ourselves. I'll take you to a healer now, and he'll help you." Brian lied briefly on the move, trying not to look into her dull, almost colorless eyes. Brian took his wife in his arms and carried her to the car. She weighed almost nothing. Her body seemed to consist of nothing but bones. Brian was disgusted even to hold her in his arms, and nausea came to his throat from the smell of pills that soaked through her skin. He put her in the back seat, covered her with a blanket, and got behind the wheel. He started the car and drove away from the city. They drove for more than 4 hours until they found themselves in a deep forest. He wanted to throw her right in the woods at first, but then he caught sight of an abandoned old house that apparently belonged to a gamekeeper or some local hermit. Brian took his wife in his arms and carried her into the house. He left her on the big bed and left without saying a word. Stacy knew he was leaving her in this old house. She understood that her husband would not come back. He laid her on the bed, and tears of despair and understanding ran from her eyes that she would die of hunger, here, all alone. She looked at him, but Brian averted his eyes. He also understood that everything had become clear to her. Brian left, started his car, and disappeared into the distance. Stacy was lying on a huge bed and crying, unable to turn around or get up. Her mouth soon dried up, and her whole body began to ache, and she really needed to use the bathroom, but no one else would help her. Stacy fell into oblivion, then woke up again, but at some point, she realized that she was not alone in the house. "Here, have a drink. It will make you feel better," said a man whose face was blurring before her eyes. Stacy took a few sips but couldn't go any further. Then the man lifted her head with a big hand and helped her finish the drink. She fell asleep again. Stacy woke up much later, and that's when she saw that some man with a beard was watching her. He came up to her, smiled, and said, "Good morning. You've finally come to your senses. And I've always said nature heals everything." She had never felt this good in the last 4 years of her illness. There was no pain, and everything cleared up in her eyes. She even felt that she could breathe deeply. "My husband brought me here because he wanted to leave me. The doctors refused me, and then my husband. I thought I was going to die here alone," Stacy admitted a bit haphazardly. "You won't die. Now you definitely won't die since the drugs help. I've been taking care of you for 2 months. I kept thinking that you wouldn't pull through, but you clung to life as best you could. That's it. Now you won't fall into such oblivion. You'll see. You'll be back on your feet in a couple of weeks. Just don't be afraid. I have a dog, and he slept with you all the time here at the foot of the bed. You may not remember him, but he's kind and good. His name is Dick. He stayed with you when I went to the forest," the man said with a smile. "Your husband is a scumbag. Marriages are made in heaven. God has sent you this test." "Excuse me, but why do you live in the forest?" suddenly asked Stacy, who decided to change the subject. "Me? I became a beggar, fired from work, and the bank took the house. I had to beg in the city, and there I met Dick. And then he went into the woods and led me to this house. I have established relationships with local villagers. I help them with household chores for groceries. That's how I got settled, and I've been living here for 2 years. I would be glad to return to society, but I have neither money nor the opportunity," the man said with a sad smile. They talked until the morning. So week after week went by, and along with gratitude, love blossomed in Stacy's soul. They understood each other without a word. Stacy had never felt so happy, but one day when she was completely stronger, she decided to leave. He let her go, even though he didn't believe she would ever come back. Stacy was too beautiful for him, too well off to spend the rest of her life with a beggar somewhere in the deep woods. He took her to the village, where they took her to the city. Stacy went to her lawyer first, and a real nightmare began. It turned out that her husband had almost registered her as deceased, and there were only a few days left before the verdict of the court was announced. But Stacy made huge efforts to stop it and fought for more than one day. The court's decision was overturned, then Stacy withdrew all the money from her account and bought a good house in a small town with good infrastructure nearby. She repurchased her car that her husband had pawned, but she never showed her face to him. Stacy immediately got behind the wheel and drove to that very remote forest to that house. When the man who had healed her, whose name was Jack, came out, he was happy to see his beloved, who had disappeared for 2.5 weeks. "Get ready, I bought us a house, and bring Dick. There's a big yard there. And don't, Jack, just don't be embarrassed, you saved my life. And I'll give us a new home," she said triumphantly, hugging him. By the evening, they were in a new modern cottage, enjoying every minute spent together. Stacy still did not believe that she had not only survived there in the deep forest, but also met her happiness. When the lawsuit came to Brian in court, he could not believe his eyes. It's been 6 months since he took his wife to die in the woods. He didn't even realize what was going on right away. He appeared in court and was stunned to see a healthy, beautiful wife next to a large, handsome man who hugged her like a hefty bear, and against his background, Brian seemed like a puny reed. The divorce thundered for Brian like a bolt from the blue. He looked at the court order and did not believe that he remained a beggar. His wife's account, his wife's apartment, even the old country house belonged to his wife, and he was left without a job, without an education, absolutely unfit for independent life. Naturally, Jody left him a long time ago, having found a more satisfying place. He rushed from his place to his wife to beg for forgiveness, but a hefty man overshadowed the fragile Stacy. Brian did not dare to act, and he retreated, seeing off the beautiful couple. It was all over. Brian was so happy when he finally left his wife to die in the woods. He was so happy having fun with his young and beautiful mistress. He thanked fate every day for such a wonderful plan. And now what? Now he would have to go back to his mother and live with her until he got his life back on track. Brian soberly assessed the situation and understood that he would not be able to get settled and would rely on his mother. It was a late, warm summer evening. Stacy was sitting on a wide bench in the garden, her head resting on Jack's shoulder. He was hugging her, holding her close, and Stacy felt sure she had never been so happy. Stacy looked at her future husband and thanked him for saving her life. If it weren't for him, she would have died there in the woods. He looked at her and thanked her for her love, for the house, for a new job, and for happiness. If it weren't for her, he would have spent years alone in the forest. It was as if they were sent to each other by fate. The lovers were sitting in the garden, inhaling the scent of herbs after the rain. They just enjoyed each other and were happy that they could be together.